Hey, my name is Cathy Collins, and I'll be co-hosting Airing Addiction with Lisa Blanchard.
No one story is the same as someone else's. Everybody's journey is different.
Same thing on the table.
Having run substance use treatment programs for over 20 years, trying to make sure that we are welcoming to all. I love the idea that kind of having that exposure and that affirming place, even for one person, impacts that milieu, which then can impact maybe the broader recovery community, the community at large. I mean, I really love that thought. And welcome to this episode of Airing Addiction. As you may have known, we are actually running more Airing Addiction episodes this month because it is September and it is Recovery Month. And we want to celebrate as many recovery stories as possible and share as many resources as possible. So I'm Lisa Blanchard, and with me I have Catherine Collins.
Hi, I'm Cathy Collins, and it's a pleasure to be here again for Recovery Month. And I have the honor of introducing our guest for today, who happens to be a friend and a New York Times best-selling author, which I love because I'm an author groupie. And it really is a pleasure to introduce Maureen Cavanagh. And once you hear a little bit about her story, I think you'll be really intrigued in all the resources she has. So Lisa is going to jump in and ask the first question of Maureen, but we're happy to have you here, Maureen.
Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it. It's nice to see your smiling face as always.
So Maureen, again, thank you so much for joining us. I will kind of start this by saying I just read your book, and doing this work, I read a lot of recovery-oriented books. I read a lot about recovery stories, but I absolutely read this in less than 2 days. Mm-hmm. You did a wonderful job. I mean, you're an excellent writer, but really what grasped me is your ability to kind of share your perspective as a mother, right? And so I think that's what grabbed me honestly the most, since I surround myself with recovery, as you do now as well. But I'm also a mother. And so, I really encourage everybody to read it. But for those who have not read your book, it's your story from your perspective of a mother, of a daughter with addiction. How can you share some of your story? Obviously not the whole thing, but, as much as you're comfortable sharing about that story.
Yeah, I feel like my entire life is out there, so there's almost nothing I'm not comfortable sharing. I never, ever in a million years ever anticipated writing a memoir. I mean, how ridiculous would that be for a regular person to write a memoir? And honestly, this story is so important because it's so common and it's happening to everybody. So it was happening to everybody I that was around me. It definitely is happening to everybody that's around me now. And I felt like my story was so many people's story. And that's really what makes it so powerful. I'd always written fiction. That was I did always have that dream of writing a book, but it was a made up book full of made up people and made up stories. I didn't want to have to live the book. And but when I was approached to write the book, I actually through the person that wrote about me in the New York Times, Catherine Seeley, she was the New England bureau chief at the time. She had done 2 stories on Magnolia New Beginnings and on my daughter and that trip going into treatment once again. That's what the story was basically about. And an agent in New York saw the story and asked her to write it, but she couldn't because it's a conflict of interest because she was already writing for the newspaper. And I somehow talked him into reading some of my writing to see if I could write it. And that's kind of how that happened. And after he was like, okay, you can write the book, you can write, so let's get going. I thought to myself, oh my God, what did I do? Because now I'm sharing every personal thing that's happened to me in my life. But I realized that this was a story that needed to be told. And it needed to be told in a way where you open that first page and you can't put it down because you're in the story. Because I wanted not only for people that were going through this to understand they weren't alone, but I also wanted people that had no relationship with addiction or not a close personal relationship with addiction to step into that book and feel like they were in the book, and I wanted them to get taken in by the book and the story. And I think that's happened quite a bit from the feedback that I get, because this is a journey like no other. This is a nightmare, because you have, and I had, the most important person to me in the world, my heart, walking around. That's what they say, right? It's like having your heart walking around outside your body after you have a child. And now this child is overdosing more than 13 times. That brought her to the hospital, where she arrived at the hospital blue and without a pulse, and probably 20 extra times that's a friend Narcaned her, over 40 different treatment centers. It was a nightmare. It was a nightmare every single day I woke up. And through that nightmare, I was able to create this support group for families and bring people together and do lots of other positive things with this, so that I always felt like it couldn't be for nothing. There had to be something positive that came out of this horrible story, because I didn't know how it was going to end. And the paperback actually has an extra chapter in it, which tells the ending, and not the ending, but the what happened. I know I watch myself, because you never totally relax. But a year later, after the book was published, what was going on. So I love the paperback version of it, because I'm able to get that extra part of the story out. But I do find that it's brought Magnolia New Beginnings to where we have over 25,000 members and followers, and it grows all the time. So
yeah, I have a question about that, because what I gleaned from the book when I read it, when it was first out, is how hard the process is to. I mean, people talk about it all the time. I have this person, I can't help them. You have to call every day, 7 a.m. You have to do this, you have to do that, jump through hoops, run around the block. It's like, it's not as easy as saying, my child needs help, can you please admit them? And I think that's one of the premises that you founded Magnolia on. Is that correct? To sort of help people through that process?
Absolutely. I mean, in Massachusetts, we're extraordinarily lucky, because we have a fairly, compared to other places, robust system where you can get where a person can get into treatment. And I say can get into treatment rather than get them into treatment, because we can't get them into treatment. I mean, I work as a family recovery coach right now, and most of my day is spent explaining to people that you can line things up, you can support them, you can encourage them, you can believe in them, even when they don't believe in themselves. And you can't get anybody into treatment. They have to be willing to walk through the door themselves. And if they're so consumed by their addiction, there's Section 35. I mean, that's in the extreme case, but it's very hard. But in Massachusetts, it's easier, believe it or not, as hard as it is. In the rest of the country, in most places in the rest of the country, they would give anything to have a system like we have in Massachusetts. Wow. So it's incredibly difficult. And then even like myself, I had excellent insurance. It was still impossible. So parents go through this nightmare. And a lot of them, when you first get into this, you don't realize what's out there. You don't know what to be careful of. You don't know what to look for. And you have absolutely no idea how to parent a child that's going through this. So that's kind of what the idea of the groups were founded on. I mean, I Googled that. I put something in Google to look for a treatment center the first time she agreed to go to treatment.
Yeah, I think a lot of people still do that.
Of course they do. Yeah.
No one knows where to start. And, I think the sort of, the multi-visits, the parents are losing hope and that this is ever going to happen. So I think if they can get connected to a group such as yours, and there are other groups, but getting connected to a group where they see they're not alone, that
Right.
they're, this is a normal, sadly, it's a normal part of the disease or the addiction, is that, it might not take on the first try,
It takes an average of 8. I mean, and you have outliers, like bringing that number to 8. My daughter, 40. Some people 1. So it doesn't have to be 8, but and it's certainly thrown off by people that go in 30, 40 times, but, you know, my daughter currently has a little over 3 years of sobriety. So when people say, when do you stop? You know, yeah. When do you stop? When do you say enough? Never. You don't say ever
Never.
say enough.
Yeah.
Who says enough when it comes to your child or anybody you love, right?
Right.
You know, you stick by them and you support their good decisions and you encourage them and you believe in them until they can believe in themselves. And you take care of yourself because you need to be strong and there for them when they're ready.
And so a couple of thoughts about that. It's been a bit of a theme this recovery month on a lot of our podcasts that, you know, that it can take multiple times. It doesn't have to. I think that's a great way to frame it, but it can. And I tell this to our staff, right? Because especially we run inpatient, we treat thousands in outpatient, you know, it's never wasted time, right? Even if that treatment episode wasn't the one that prompted long-term recovery or a long-term period of recovery, you know, there are still some seeds that were planted. There's still some learning that happened that'll get you closer and closer to your path. And so understanding that and having patience, and I think that's a hard thing for parents to see, right? And see that that choice involved in the process, right? So your child falls and breaks their leg. There's not a choice about treatment, right? There's not like you need a cast and you help them access that. You take them to the ER, you take them to the doctors, you do what you need to do. But there's such a choice element in entering addiction treatment. And recognizing that all you can do is set the conditions that allow them to make that choice, and kind of step back, you know, and so that how it's, I mean, I just read the book, right? So it's pretty fresh in my mind, but you certainly didn't know that, you know, starting out, right?
Oh, and God, no.
Learn that over time.
I thought she'd be like it was a conveyor belt, you know, like she would step onto the treatment conveyor belt and she would go through it and then she would come out all fixed. I really thought that. And this is a person who comes from a family full of addiction and drug use and all kinds of mental health issues. I distanced myself from that because I thought I could walk away from it, like it wouldn't follow me in my genetics. And none of that went on in front of her. But having lived it, you would think that I would know. But because she came to me the first time, she talked to me the first time, and she agreed to go to treatment the first time, I really did think it was going to be one and done. It really didn't occur to me that it wasn't going to be.
Yeah. What was sorry, I forget, but what was the initial impetus for her addiction? Did it start with a medical issue she was prescribed oxys for, or something like a dental treatment, or was it just she was just a product of drinking and then drugging and then
she was the kid that this is my daughter. She went with her father to New Hampshire and she must have been about 12, maybe 13, and there was some big cliff and all these young guys were jumping off of it. And here's this 12-year-old girl into the water. Yeah. And they were having a blast. And my ex was, nobody else wanted to go. She was with a girlfriend. She was with her brother. They were like, I'm not doing that. She was like, I'll do it. That's my daughter. You know what I mean? And off she went, and then back up, and off she went. And she had a blast. But she was the one that wanted to try things. Mm-hmm. And she tried things. And then she started to realize that it made her feel like she fit in. It made her feel less teenager-y, you know what I mean? So she started drinking and probably smoking pot and doing some very mild things, you know, comparatively to what she did. I didn't even know it, so it wasn't a lot. And I caught her once in high school and she got punished and took her phone away and all these other things. And we talked about this because of the family history. So I think that it was just, she started and it made her feel good, which is why people do drugs.
Yeah, totally.
You hear all this, trauma and this and that. Yeah, sometimes, but sometimes people try things and they have that genetic predisposition and off they go. And they try them and continue to do them because they had fun. And then it becomes pretty quickly not fun anymore.
Not fun.
And I can't stop. And that's what it turns into. And then traumatic things happen and it becomes harder and harder to stop. Mm-hmm. this is what we have to explain to our young people.
Right.
Sometimes trauma that leads to substance use, and sometimes there's substance use that leads to trauma. And, and we don't know enough, I say this all the time, we don't know enough about who's going to go down that path and who's not, right? Who's going to experiment and be okay, and who's going to kind of follow a path of addiction. We know genetics plays into it, but certainly not all. Like, it didn't impact you, it impacted your daughter.
Right. And I don't understand that.
We don't know, right? There's not like a test you can take. There's not a blood test that you can say, how predisposed am I to addictions?
And trauma is different for everybody. I know I did a 3-day training with Bessel van der Kolk on he's the one that wrote The Body Keeps the Score. It's fascinating. And trauma, I mean, you could, have some horrific thing happen to you and still be fine. And I could see my dog get hit by a car at 10, and that may be enough to tip the scale.
Totally. Yeah.
So, you can't protect your children enough. You can protect them, but you can't protect them from everything. And so who knows what it is? What difference does it make? We have to teach our children resiliency in general, I think, and healthy self-esteem, and a bunch of other things that make for a healthy adult. And then we cross our fingers, and let them know that no matter what happens, we love them and we're there for them.
And that really struck me in your book. Sorry, Kathy. And honestly, like when I finished it late last night, my poor 2 girls were sleeping because they're actually listening second week of school and getting some sleep before they do remote learning. But I went right in their rooms and like hugging, kissing them, woke them up the same way. They're like, "What is going on with you, Mom?" But all of those things, you can love as much as you love. You can share all of that, and it might not be enough. So that awareness to see the signs of it happening, it's those, is what's.
And the funny thing about that is, when I speak, because I do a lot of public speaking, so when I speak in schools, I have this great graphic that I created, if I must say so myself. I have this great graphic, I didn't mean it like that, but it shows the typical signs of early drug use, typical signs in a young person, typical signs of early like suicidal ideation in a young person, and the typical signs of adolescence, or the behaviors of somebody in adolescence. And they're almost all the same. I mean, of course, sometimes not always, suicidal ideation, early drug use, there's the severity is the thing you would measure typical adolescence against, but not always. I have 4 children, and there's 1 or 2, maybe 2 of my children's early adolescence, which now that I know, they didn't have drug problems, but boy, did it, looking back on it, that's the kids that really were very difficult. She was awesome. I didn't see any of those things in high school with her. So it's hard. And I think that going back, I would always kind of think of drug use first. And I know that sounds, kind of crazy, but that's, or depression first. I would think that first, instead of thinking, it's just adolescence, it's just going through those teenage years. And not to be a crazy person, but I think you have to really address those issues when someone's having those behaviors, because you don't want to be sorry, and maybe it's just adolescence, but it's best to approach those things first, drug tests and, therapy, possibly, if somebody's really, and if the therapist just gets them through adolescence, then great.
Right. Well, that brought what Lisa said about that, and how you went in to hug your kids, and I love you, and I think that speaks to both sides of the equation, because even the title of the book, because like it seems like love, if we could love people enough, we would cure that addiction. Just like, don't you get it? And like, it's not that simple. Same way with Mom, if you loved me, you would let me just do this because this is so great. And it's like the both, as the addict and as the parent or the loved one of it. It's like, if love worked, everyone would be out of a job.
Everyone would be fine. Could I share where the title of the book comes from?
No, tell us.
So there was one night after multiple relapses, and I would say this is probably about 3/4 of the way into the story. And she had was doing good and she's doing well. And she was happy, really happy that she was doing well. And she seemed to be putting everything together, and she relapsed again. And she had at this time been at a sober living up in New Hampshire. So some great people that she was in a couple of sober houses associated with this treatment center got together and went and looked for her. And she had taken off. They're looking for her all over the place. I'm calling her over and over again. Finally, I fall asleep. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I get a knock on the door and they're bringing her home. Awesome, awesome person that she, that I love dearly to this day, made sure she got home. And she comes in. She didn't want to come in, but I kind of dragged her in. And she's sitting on my kitchen floor and she's crying and she's just so incredibly distraught and unhappy. And I looked at her and I said, sweetie, I love you so much and you're going to die. And she looked up at me and she said, if you love me, you'd let me die. So this is the depth of the sorrow and that self-hatred and just the depression that goes along with drug use. She didn't want to be in this situation. It wasn't any fun anymore. But the physiology of the brain tells us that there's changes in the brain that happen that make people keep going back and going back. And I don't think I really completely understood until that moment. And I always tell people, as sad and depressed and upset as you are, your loved one is all those same things, and they're struggling with this too. There's these two great researchers, Bradshaw and Shumway, that I've been in touch with and talking to, and they're doing research I think it's out of the University of Texas Tech, on the parts of the brain that respond, that are firing when someone has a craving, and drawing a parallel to the parts of the brain that are firing when a parent has this need that doesn't make any sense to do the thing that they know they shouldn't do to help their child. It's the same parts of the brain. So they're showing like pictures of their loved one getting into treatment, and those same parts of the brain that fire when somebody's having a craving are firing. And this is why parents do things that we say, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. I knew I shouldn't have done it, but I did it anyhow. Right. And that's what's going on. So when we say, I felt crazy, yeah, I felt crazy too. I went after people twice my size with a baseball bat. I don't do that in regular life.
Well, they often say, as you're probably learning now, because your career sort of switched due to this, sort of like it's a blessing. This was a gift, even though at the time, I'm sure it didn't feel like a gift. It was a gift that guided you to now be able to help others. And I was thinking that, sometimes the family's sicker than the addict, or
a lot of the time.
Most of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, and so like now maybe you could tell us a little bit how you're addressing that in your career today, because that you weren't doing today what you weren't doing back then, what you were doing today, and sort of maybe a little progression of that.
Yeah, it's like, talk about a complete switch. I was a special education teacher. So my background is in education. And I feel like, and I also have a degree in nonprofit management. So I feel like it's kind of changed, but it's kind of all come together too, that I'm doing things that I was trained for in a different setting. I never expected to be, doing this. So I run Magnolia New Beginnings, which we have Facebook support groups. And I've been doing that since 2014. So that's like one thing that we do. Another thing that we've been doing is providing sober living scholarships. That's where our financial resources go to. We provide sober living scholarships through select mass health treatment centers, including Spectrum. We've worked, it's probably my longest relationship is with the people at the Farris Center and with Spectrum. So I loved Farris because I know it's changed a little bit, but it used to be 90 days. So people would come out in 90 days and they would use their benefit for halfway. So they couldn't go to a halfway. So they needed sober living, and we were able to provide sober living scholarships. But right now we work primarily with the Department of Corrections and with drug courts across the state of Massachusetts. And that's part of our financial mission. The other thing that I do personally is I work as a family recovery coach. And what that is, I mean, it's a kind of a loose definition of family. So it's anybody that is a loved one of somebody who's struggling. But I also, I've done every training known to mankind. That's what I was saying. I trained with Bessel van der Kolk. And what I've been able to do is kind of look at something and say, you know what? I want to learn about this and I want to learn about it with the person that created it. So I did craft training with Robert Myers. I've been able to do things like that and figure out what I needed when I was going through this and become trained in those things. I'm just finishing up my KDAC to be a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. So I'm just like a sponge anyhow. I always love school and educating myself. But I'm educating myself on all the things I felt that I needed when I was going through this so that I can help families as they go through it. Because if we can educate families, I was, during all those 40 different entries into some form of treatment, I had 3 family meetings. What is that? That's insane. There was no family support. There was very little family support, I should say. There was no direct support for me because I was a complete uninformed, uneducated maniac in the very beginning. And there was no help for me. So if we can start helping our families, I think that's a game changer. This is their person's biggest support system. And like I said, family loosely, whoever it is, it's their support system. If we can start educating those people and supporting them while they try to deal with the hardest thing they've ever gone through, so that they can support their loved one with the hardest thing they've ever gone through, that maybe we can get on top of this. But what we keep doing is giving people, 15 to 28 days and then throwing them back into this disaster of crazed, nervous wrecks that, even if they're not living with them, they don't understand. They don't understand post-acute withdrawal. They don't understand what a relapse looks like before a relapse. So they're constantly staring at the person and looking at their eyes and doing all these other crazy things we do. So I have also created a program called FAST. It's Family Focused Addiction Support Training. And before COVID, I was booked all over the country to do these 4-day trainings, create family support meetings in different areas through treatment centers, through community organizations, through a variety of places and hospitals. And the goal was to train people on how to work with families. So it's NADAC approved. It's 21 CEUs for social workers and a variety of anybody in this state, anybody licensed by DSAS. So I tried to create this training so that I could educate the staff and different people in the community that are working with families on what families need and how they need to hear it. Because I can say things to families that somebody who maybe their case manager who's 27 may not feel comfortable saying because they're not a parent and they may not be comfortable hearing it from that person. But so it's a lot about communication too, and group dynamics, group facilitation. And so that's what I was doing before COVID. And I'm kind of resurrecting it a little bit. And we're training people to facilitate online groups, both in Magnolia next month. So that we'll have two a week to begin with. We're going to bring in grief support groups. We're going to bring in sibling groups. And we're going to start having these online Zoom and streaming onto Magnolia groups. I'd like to see several a day, every day, so that people have someplace to go, because I feel like COVID, the isolation of COVID, the NAs and AA caught on pretty quickly, but there wasn't a lot for families. And we actually had a woman that passed away that committed suicide, and just the isolation was too much. And I know that was the final straw, the isolation.
Yeah, I think the isolation is the worst part of the disease in general, but then for family members dealing with it, they have nobody to. So these trainings that you're talking about that are going to be on Facebook or on your other platforms, are those for families or are those for people that want to like the hospitals or the staff? Are those for family members? Like I know a couple people who have family members that are currently struggling, but doing an intervention is like, people don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Is
See,
it,
I'm an interventionist too, so I feel like we can do intervention before the intervention. We can get the family strong and support them, and they may not need an intervention.
Yep.
So, it's much more profitable to do an intervention, but it's much more, if you train the family and change the family dynamic, sometimes you don't need those things.
Right.
So, so the trainings are going to be, sponsored through treatment centers, through community groups, through hospitals. The one we're doing right now is, we're doing it within Magnolia, some select people, and we're going to launch the groups. Hopefully, eventually, there'll be other nonprofits or community groups that will support the whole 4-day training for family members. And that training, it can be just for family members. Or it can be, which is what I would love to say, is a community group or a treatment center maybe train 10 of their staff and 10 family members, so that they can have support groups and they can learn from each other. And because we do learn from each other, that it's.
So Maureen, a couple of things about this. Like, a family is such an important piece for Spectrum, but I really love the perspective that you have, right? Coming from the family versus coming from the treating provider, right? So in our inpatient programs, we have family engagement specialists that involve people from admission straight through, as much as, and sometimes the individual won't let there be connection, but as much as we can, we do family education forums across all of our 15 outpatient sites. We haven't yet moved those virtual. And so I think there's a real opportunity. But I'd really love, obviously not right now, but I'd love for us to talk at another time about how we can work together to do that. We've done a Shatterproof family education session, and I don't know where Shatterproof is with doing that, but this is so important it should be important to everybody's mission, but it's so important to our mission. And I think that you have so much to bring to it. So I'd love for us to talk more about how that program that you've developed, we could work together.
See, I don't hold myself out to be a therapist, and there's always stuff that I learn. As a matter of fact, I learned something from my own therapist that now I'm using. So it's the idea of the two, the parents and the therapist meeting in the middle someplace and conducting groups together and learning from each other. I think that's the way to go. But there's things that I can say, like anybody that knows me knows, if you talk to me, I will say this: whatever you decide to do has got to be your own personal decision, because this is a potentially fatal disease, and you need to look back at your decision and say, you know what, either way this goes, because it can go either way, I can live with this decision. I mean, it's not going to make it any easier, but I can live with what I'm doing. So therefore, when people in these meetings where people talk about, you know what, you got to kick them out, don't talk to them for 3 months, and they tell somebody who's vulnerable that, and they listen to them, and something terrible happens.
they can't live with themselves. Yeah.
And they can't live with themselves. And the person that said kick them out and 3 months, so you're going to hold this person's hand for the rest of their lives?
Right.
It can't be that. We have to present people with an abundance of information, and then support them in their own decision, and be realistic, because there's no guarantee. I can work with somebody all day, every day, and something terrible can still happen. It's just, the only reason my daughter's still alive is not because I was frantically running around doing things, and because I created groups, and people would say, oh, and I educated myself like you wouldn't believe, and connected with so many people to find out more. None of that is the reason she's still alive. She's still alive because she got incredibly lucky. And what a horrible thing to leave to luck. So I'd like to see people get educated earlier and understand how this works earlier, so that, because so many people lose their children on the way to being comfortable with their decisions, some of them never get there. Some of them make decisions and do things that they regret, and that they would have done differently had they known more. And that must be a horrible, horrible feeling.
Well, that sort of brings me to a question that we were thinking, like, we'd love to have your daughter sometime talk with us, because her story is fascinating also. And like, what do you attribute her final, just because she was ready, or like that's always my question. Like, when you're sick and tired of being sick and tired and you're desperate enough, you're ready. I mean, is that what happened to her for her final time? No.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think she knows. She was getting really tired of doing this. That's true. But I mean, she got out. The living situation where she went, I was not supportive of at all. But I said, there's nothing I can do. I can't support this financially because I don't think it's a good decision. But I love you and I'm here for you. And that's kind of, I had gotten to that point by then. I didn't try to talk her out of it because there was no point in talking her out of it. She was going to do what she was going to do anyhow. And I don't want to lose her. So there was no point in cutting her off, right? Just because she wasn't agreeing with me. And her decision, by anybody's, any intelligent person would say, this is the worst thing in the whole world. And I remember saying, you realize this is a very, very foolish decision, one that nobody could possibly support. And she said, I know, but I'm going to do it anyhow.
Oh.
And it turned out that it was the right decision for her. And she wound up getting a job, and she wound up going back to school, and one thing led to another. And she also got on the Vivitrol shot, which was the right thing for her at that time too.
So great.
That's such a great example of there's not one path, right? Like, and I think especially as parents, right? You want, give me the best treatment plan, give me the gold standard, and I will put my child through it. And none of us know, including the individual that's struggling to enter recovery yet, until they kind of find their way on that path, what that path is for them.
Right.
And it's completely different from the person next to them, even if there's really similar circumstances and conditions. And so it's such a great example of that. That was her path. Her path was, moving to that place that you wouldn't have agreed with, getting a job,
Yeah, it was just, she made it work. And you can see, if you read the book, you can see that I slowly get to the point where I'm starting to take care of myself again. And I don't think that there's that's not a coincidence that things started to change for her too. When I stopped just riding that roller coaster with her, it wasn't helping. And, typically if something's not helping, it's usually hurting. And it was definitely hurting. And
it doesn't mean you're throwing in the towel. It just means
I mean, but I knew what I could fix, and I knew what was my role in this. And my role was not to stand in the way of her doing what she wanted to do, because I couldn't do that. That was not up to me. And I finally started to get that. And finally but I didn't at any point say, that's it, I'm not talking to you if you do this. I'm not going to do that.
No,
I don't want to lose my daughter any sooner than I might have lost her. And thank God it turned out to be the right decision for her.
So how did you take care of yourself? Like what was self-care for you?
Well, there was none for years. I mean, my idea of self-care was being a bigger maniac. You know what I mean? I was just like crazed and sick and not sleeping and just doing everything wrong. I think what happened eventually is I realized that I was making myself sick and I wasn't helping. So I started to turn my phone off at night. That was huge. That was huge. I just stopped answering the phone all night long. I took time out for myself where I was away from the phone, because the phone became my this like the umbilical cord, where I was still attached to her by the phone. So she would call me and text me and I would answer her immediately. And I stopped doing that. And when I stopped doing that, I started to calm down a little bit. And, and when I started to calm down a little bit, I started to meditate. I started to do other things that were for me. And usually I would say, well, I'm working. That's what I do for myself. I have to work. No, that wasn't it. It needed to be something that was calming and supportive of my own recovery.
Wow. There's a lot to be said for self-care too. They put your own oxygen mask on first, or you can't save anyone else in this little ship.
When I work with families that say that I can't do that. I can't do that. I can't. And I'd say, well, wait a minute. Now you're asking your loved one to do something they're telling you can't do, right? They can't do this and they can't do that. So, and you're not able to do the things that are best for you. So why don't you lead by example and do the things that are best for you you don't have to do it 24 hours a day, but take that break and take that time to take care of yourself and show that, yes, I can do the thing that I thought I couldn't do. and take that burden off of them, because they're carrying you too. You're a mess, and that just makes people feel worse, right? You being a mess doesn't make them get well.
Right.
Look what
If
you're
it did,
doing to me doesn't make them get well. It makes them want to go use drugs. That's what that does.
Yeah, it feeds that cycle of negativity for them.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so we only have 5 minutes left, although I could talk with you all day. And usually our kind of wrap up question, if you don't mind me jumping in, Cathy, but it's interesting because we have both a book and a podcast. So I think it's our opportunity. So we usually ask every guest, like, do you have a book or a podcast you recommend? But because you actually have both of those things, I'd wonder if you could just, say out loud for the folks that might be just listening in their cars or, not in front of, a screen, the name of your book, which I cannot recommend enough to anybody, whether they're in the recovery field or not. In fact, more so for those that aren't, right? If you are a parent, that's when you should be reading it. And, tell us a little bit about the podcast that you have, the kind of, and what you do.
Sure. The name of the book originally was different. And the paperback is If You Love Me, A Mother's Journey Through Her Daughter's Addiction and Recovery. Yes, because it was a mother's journey through her daughter's opioid addiction, but they changed with the paperback because of the I get to talk about her recovery in it. So I'm very, very happy that that was published by Macmillan, Henry Holt in 2018, and it's available on Amazon and I would say in bookstores, but nobody's going into a bookstore anymore, I guess. But you can order it on Amazon. I would suggest getting the paperback because it has that other chapter in it. I have a podcast as well called Collateral Damage, and I felt like I was the collateral damage. This is what happens to everybody surrounding the person that is going through their substance use disorder, and all the impact that has. So we very rarely have somebody in recovery unless they have an additional story. What we have is we have people that have been affected by someone else's addiction. Last night we were lucky enough to interview Dan Snyder, who was the pharmacist from the Netflix show The Pharmacist. So we have some interesting people coming up in the fall. We're just about to launch a new season. This is the third one, and it's cdpodcast.com is the name of the website. I also am launching another website called Magnolia Recovery Resources. That's in addition to the magnolianewbeginnings.org has all the support groups on it. And this is all free. I really should say this. This is all free. The support groups are all free. magnoliarecoveryresources.com is going to have all the live groups, and we'll publicize those too in the Facebook groups. It'll have all the live Zoom support meetings, and virtual support meetings from other organizations too. So we want there to be as many Zoom possibilities for parents that are based on education and science.
Fantastic.
That are as possible. And also trainings. We're going to have trainings for families. And then in the back end, we'll have trainings for professionals that'll be for Earth Day.
Yeah. On a personal note, besides all that you're involved in, are you reading anything good yourself right now? If you have time.
I actually haven't had time. I'm putting together these trainings. So I'm reading a book on group facilitation. How boring am I? And I'm reading a couple of other books on it. So it's like,
I know that's your free time. Back to self-care.
Yeah.
And you speak so eloquently about how helpful Learn to Cope was for you in the beginning. And so we actually have Joanne Peterson as our next guest.
Oh, that's awesome. She's awesome. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't connected with some of the people at Learn to Cope that I connected with.
Yeah, so
wonderful.
Excellent.
It's such a pleasure having you on here, Maureen.
It's been awesome. Thank you.
Really, I just love to talk about it. And like I said, at some point, getting to see your daughter and potentially talk to her would be fun because she's a miracle, really. Not only is it luck, but I also think there's a miracle in there as well. And but hearing your story and all your resources that you have, for me personally, it's been wonderful. So Lisa, I'm sure you.
Yeah, the power of supporting each other. It's really something to be said about it.
And I love that online presence because we've all moved to that online. And I think you said there's so much NA, right? Like, so at any point in any day, you could just go on and find a meeting. And it sounds like you're trying to strive for that any point in any day for a family member to find a meeting.
Absolutely. That's what I want. I want us all to be supporting and connecting with each other whenever that's needed.
Amazing. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
on that note, I can tell you, we will follow up. I have some resources I will get you for meetings to get onto that link. And on behalf of Airing Addiction, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, Maureen. It was
You have a
wonderful.
good day.
Thanks
right.
for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.